All right, so we are jumping in to sort of continuing our conversation from last week in some ways something entirely new. We are still in the Torah, at least this week, reading the story of Joseph and his family and his brothers in Egypt and that whole craziness that comes with that. And we are in this week's section of Talmud talking a little bit about the sort of the end of the encounter, which is to say, Joseph meets his brothers, and there's all this sort of back and forth, sort of him playing tricks on them in some way, right? Manipulating them to reveal the state of their father and his younger brother Benjamin and stuff like that. And so we're going to pick up in our Talmud an exploration of that. Now, I want to offer an important reminder, which is Talmud is associative, meaning to say that the rabbis are not linear. I mean, we've learned this already in our learning, but the rabbis are not linear, meaning to say that they will sort of on a drop of a hat change the subject. We are going to learn from tractate Masechet Megillah. It's one of my favorites. It's the very first Talmud, first Mishnah and first Talmud that I've ever learned, and I have a lot of love for it. Masechet Megillah is ostensibly about the Book of Esther, the holiday of Purim, things like that. But it takes these really wonderful detours around the rules of Torah reading and sort of synagogue life and other stories, and including our story about Joseph. And that's the context in which we're learning today. Can everybody see this? Is it too big, too small? Looks okay? Okay. We are on
We are cut off this, I think maybe me, the view.
Yeah, that might be on you because mine's not cut off, but maybe I'll
yeah, I got it now. I got it.
Great. Okay, great. So you can see we're not going to read the parts about Purim in the Book of Esther, but it has this whole conversation about Esther and why certain language is what it is. But then it totally it goes to a totally different subject, which is our parsha this week about Joseph and Benjamin. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph here?
I'll do it. There aren't many of us. Before continuing, is that what you want?
Yes.
Before continuing its midrashic interpretation of the rest of the Book of Esther, the Gemara expounds a verse concerning Joseph that relates to the Megillah. To all of them, he gave each man changes of clothing, but to Benjamin, he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing. The Gemara asks, is it possible that in the very thing from which that righteous man Joseph had suffered as his father's show of favoritism towards him aroused the enmity of his brothers?
Keep going.
He himself should stumble by showing favoritism to Benjamin?
All right, let's pause because that's really, I think, the first end of the first thought. So, which is to say, right, we have this verse from the Parsha. To all of them, Joseph gave each person, his brothers, changes of clothing, but to Benjamin, his immediate brother, he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing, right? So from the text itself, it would seem as though Joseph is treating his brother Benjamin differently. Now, just as a reminder, right? So Jacob has 4 wives. 2 of them are Rachel and Leah, and he has 2 others, and each of them have some assortment of children, and Benjamin and Joseph share a mother, right? So unlike potentially all the other brothers, Benjamin and Joseph reasonably have a relationship that is different than the others. But in any case, he gives Benjamin more resources here. And I think it's reasonable for the Gemara then to say, why is this treatment different? But it's not exactly that. What the Gemara asks is it possible that the very thing from which the righteous man, which is so interesting, right? That we've now described Joseph as a tzaddik, as a righteous man, had the very thing that he suffered from, which is Jacob showing him favoritism, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, which ostensibly made his brothers hate him, that he should then do the same thing, right? Which is to say, right, Joseph was, as the Torah tells us, beloved by his father in a way that was different than his other brothers, and his brothers hated him for it. And so it would seem, when he's now giving Benjamin 300 pieces of silver and 4 additional changes of clothing than what he gave to his other brothers, that perhaps he too is showing favoritism and therefore falling into the same trap as his father did, and sort of like perpetuating this negative, this toxic dynamic. Is everybody with that argument? At least the question. All right, let's find out how it's going to get resolved. Sheila, why don't you keep going?
As Rava bar Mechasseya said that Rav Chama bar Guria said that Rav said, due to the weight of 2 sela of...
Oh no, we lost it.
his special coat, the story progressed and our forefathers went down to Egypt. How then could Joseph have displayed similar favoritism towards Benjamin? Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said he was not showing favoritism. Rather, he intimated to him that a descendant was destined to issue from him, who would go out from the presence of the king wearing 5 royal garments, as it is stated. And Mordecai went forth from the presence of the king in royal apparel of sky blue and white, and with great crown of gold, or a wrap of fine linen and purple. I don't agree. I think this is stretching it.
It's definitely a stretch. Let's unpack it little by little. Let's make sure we understand. So there are 2 things happening here. First is we have the question: should Joseph seems as though he is falling under the same trap. So as Rava bar Machasya said, right, he's quoting Rav Chama bar Guria, who's quoting Rav. So really, we're talking about what Rav said. Due to the weight of 2 sela of fine wool that Jacob gave to Joseph, he added to what he gave Joseph beyond what the rest of his brothers. Right. So we got fuller, right, more and more greater example of what Joseph got that Jacob gave him, right, and as a result, the story, they ended up in Egypt. Right? Meaning to say, it's sort of adding to the argument. This seems problematic, right? Like this is exactly what Jacob did. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said, and I think this is a classic rabbinic solution, which is we know how the ending is, and therefore we're gonna read backwards to make sure that there isn't a problem. Which is to say, right? He says, well, Joseph knew that Benjamin was going to have a descendant, and that descendant was Mordecai, because again, the Masechet Megillah is all about Purim and the holiday of Purim in the book of Esther, right? We knew that Mordecai was going to exist and was going to wear 5 royal garments, right? Royal apparel, sky blue and white, crown of gold, fine linen, and purple. That's your 5, right? Which is to say, right, this is all fine. Those 5, right, because if we look at the verse, the 5 changes of clothing, that refers to Mordecai. And therefore, it's not favoritism. It was preparing Mordecai, preparing the way for Mordecai down the road. As Sheila points out, this is quite a stretch, right?
But also, there's another implication here.
Which is?
Mordecai, that this was, we know that this was written after 200 BCE, 200 CE, right?
The Talmud.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or put down. But that means they knew about Mordecai, the story of Mordecai, and are retrofitting something from Mordecai. What's the difference whether Mordecai had 5 royal garments? I mean, you know how I feel about this.
Yeah.
Is this what we're wasting time on?
So So
I'm sorry.
again, no, I know that it frustrates you. I want to challenge you to think about not why are they spending time on this in a negative way, but asking the question, what are they trying to accomplish? And so here, right, we have a couple of things that they're trying to accomplish. One is they're trying to make Joseph into a tzaddik, right? We know they really want Joseph to be the good guy here, right? Who was ostensibly mistreated by his brothers, mistreated by his family, ended up in prison and becomes in this powerful role. And what does he do? He saves the people, right? So they really, really want Joseph to end up as the good guy. So that's the first thing. And we know this because we've already described him as a tzaddik right here. The Gemara, is already treating him as a tzaddik. So we already know that they want him to be a good guy. The second thing is how powerful is it to be able to say, right, Mordechai wasn't just a random Jew. He was a descendant of Benjamin and our ancestors, just like us, right? Or giving him, as the term goes, yichus, giving him, family lineage here. And the rabbis are going to want to do something like that too, right? Certainly, people today will say, "Oh, I'm related to Rashi. I'm related to this rabbi or that rabbi," we treat that as a good thing, I guess. I don't think this is so different, right? I do think the argument is a literary one rather than a true explanation, which is to say that it probably is that Joseph is treating his brother with greater favor than the rest of his brothers. And so we're trying to read that out of the story, even though it's so clearly there. And so what Binyamin Bar Yefet is doing is giving us a warm and fuzzy reason why that's not the case, even though I think it's relatively obvious that he's treating his brother differently. Like,
Now, was Benjamin?
Yeah.
Was when the brothers went out, Benjamin was born already, had been born, right? When Joseph was.
I believe so.
Now, but where was Benjamin? Was he back with his father?
Correct.
And he also has the same mother as
Joseph. Correct.
So it makes some sort of sense.
I think so too.
On the other hand, I wonder how much he was really thinking.
Yeah, I mean, look, we only have what the Torah tells us. I think first of all, I also want to add one of my teachers, Rabbi Mimi Feigelson, always likes to drush on the names of the rabbis in the Talmud itself, and it's not surprising with that in mind that Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet is going to have a feeling about Binyamin in the story. I just again, whether or not it's actually true or not, I love the idea that those
but
things.
Yefet and Yafa.
Yeah. So let's see where his name is in here. Yefet, right? It could be related to Yafa, to beautiful, to pretty.
Yafa
Okay.
Toa.
Correct. So let's
interesting.
The Gemara doesn't really go too much deeper into the story, but what it does is start to pull out these funny inconsistencies in the story. So let's put this one on pause and read the next one, and perhaps we might at the end sort of evaluate how these things all fit together. Again, we're unpacking sort of layers in the story, and part of the reason why I brought this today is for us to remember that the rabbis often were. They weren't necessarily trying to resolve every problem to the satisfaction that we might, but rather that this is a collection of a bunch of different ideas. In this case, we're associating on a little bit of this story, a little bit of the different part of the story to try and derive some sort of explanations for things that seem to be in contradiction. It's no different than when we read a commentary on when we have a chumash and we have a commentary at the bottom. Here we have different alternatives here. Can I get another volunteer to read this next paragraph about the story? Anybody else want to read? Okay. Oh yes, Eric, please.
Okay, starting at the Gemara.
Mm-hmm.
The Gemara elaborates on certain elements in the story of Joseph and his brothers. The verse states with regard to Joseph, quote, and he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck, tzvare, and wept. The wording of this verse gives rise to a question as the word tzvare is plural, meaning necks. How many necks did Benjamin have, such that the verse should use the plural tzvare rather than the singular tzavar? Rabbi Elazar said.
Wait, let me pause. Let me pause you for a second, Eric. Right,
Okay.
let's just make sure we really get the question here, which is right. So the Gemara is going to go through a bunch of other stories, which I just said. The verse states, right, and he, Joseph, fell on his brother Benjamin's neck. Right, this is when all the reconciliation is happening, and it says, and you can see it here in the Hebrew, tzavare, which is plural, right, the necks of Benjamin, his brother. And so the rabbis are unsurprisingly asking themselves the question, who has so many necks? Why does it say necks? And here, right, it should say tzavar or tzavarav, his neck, but it doesn't. It says necks. So the question is, why does it say necks? And here we're going to get a couple of, I think, relatively silly, but interesting examples. All right, Eric, please continue. Rabbi Elazar.
Rabbi Elazar said, this intimates that Joseph cried over the two temples that were destined to be in the tribal territory of Benjamin and were destined to be destroyed. The same verse continues, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He cried over the tabernacle of Shiloh that was destined to be in the tribal territory of Joseph and was destined to be destroyed.
Okay, great. So here we have a second verse, right? Right. It says it's the same verse, but the other part of it. So the first part says Vayipol al tzvare Binyamin achiv rather, and he fell on the necks of his brother Benjamin, or is Benjamin his brother? And then the verse continues, Uvinyamin, and Benjamin cried upon his neck. He is referring to Joseph. All right, so now we have two references of neck, one plural, one singular. And so the question becomes, what's the distinction? Rabbi Elazar says, Joseph is crying over the two temples that were to be destroyed, right? That were going to be destroyed. And the tribal territory of Benjamin includes Jerusalem. The second half of the neck, where Benjamin is crying on Joseph, he's crying because the tabernacle of Shiloh, right, of a singular location, was destined to be in the tribal territory of Joseph and therefore destroyed. So here we have a two of something and then a one of something, and they're trying to resolve it. Now, tomorrow I'll be teaching with my Jewish learning. We're gonna and in my study for it, which was not, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about something else. There are a lot of answers. The rabbis give a lot of different answers as to what Benjamin and Joseph are crying about. This is only one potential answer. Eric, is your hand up because you have something else to say, or is that from reading?
No, that was from reading.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Ron, please.
Drop it.
Okay. I'm siding with Sheila on this. This is just a whole bunch of nonsense. But I'm looking at the Hebrew word for necks, the neck and the necks. And I'm gonna posit that it's a typographical error that the vav was missing. They dropped the vav, and they're making a big deal out of nothing.
Right. So great. So this is the beauty of being a modern Jew, modern student of Torah and Talmud, which is to say that we have a sense of the sort of Masoretic tradition in which there was copying and copying and copying of the biblical text. And it's just as likely in a historical sense that this tiny little vav got dropped when it was copied in a previous version. And that the version that we have lost that vav. On the other hand, our tradition teaches that every letter and lack thereof makes a difference and has something to be interpreted, right? The Rashi says that the very first verse of the Torah, which has a grammatical problem, right? Bereshit bara Elohim, the verb, the noun, and the verbs don't match up quite right. The Torah says, Dirshuni, like interpret me. And here the rabbis like to do that as well. So I think it's reasonable to say this interpretation doesn't cut it. That like this answer does not satisfy our need for resolution. And it could be to say it's really a typo and we're not going to worry about it. And the plain text the plain understanding of the text that it's just they fell on each other's necks and they cried. They were sad. They were overjoyed to be reconciled is really all there is to say for it. However, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet before are making a broader point that I think is really important, which is that the rabbis very much want us to see that that our existence as Jews is not just in the present, but that we have to have considerations about both the past and the future. In this case, both of those, it's the future. So we could say, yeah, this is a silly example. Like, it's probably not true that Benjamin and Joseph are really thinking about the temple to be created and destroyed. Like, that's sort of a silly anachronistic sense. But if we peel it back and we say, Benjamin and Joseph, in their reconciliation, we're thinking to themselves, there is a new future here. The future is different than it would have been had this reconciliation not happened. That becomes a powerful frame for us to relook at this text, not as an anachronistic sort of silliness, but then to say the rabbis were always wanting us to remember to think about the future. So again, whether or not you find that as an acceptable answer, it's okay if you don't. I think it is just as reasonable to say the Vav was dropped and there's nothing more to be read about it. I think it's just as reasonable as anything else. Yeah, Eric.
Technical question. Okay, I'm looking at the word on the Hebrew side, and the aleph appears to be silent with no vowel. So I would pronounce it sav-re, not savare. Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's no meaning difference. I'll tell you, because I had the same thought when I was studying this. So I'm going to zoom in really far so that people can really see. Can people see this really nice and big? Yes? So here we have tzadi with the patach at the end, the vav with the dot in it, which means that we know that it's pronounced with the V, like mitzvah. And then we have the shva here at the bottom, the two dots. So if we were to, I would probably translate this word the same as you, as tzav re, and the aleph becomes silent. However, it's probably more accurate to say that this is the shva isn't the closing of a syllable, but rather the opening of a syllable. So it ends up having that sort of like sound. So it's tzav re. It gives like the tiniest amount of oomph in it. And I think when we look at the transliteration here, that's what this A is doing. I probably would not have transliterated it this way, but Rabbi Steinsaltz didn't call me and ask my opinion. So that's what I think you're seeing. I think it's a reasonable question. And here, when we see it the other way, right, it's also an open syllable. Tza, va, re, rav, right? And this also doesn't really retain any sound. That would be my sort of grammatical response. Again, that's sort of my sense, but yeah. Does that help, Eric?
Yeah, I guess if you compare the two words, sava is definitely clear in the second usage, but not the first. So, okay, I just wondered if there was a difference in the way they transliterated. I said, well, okay.
Yeah, I mean, the question becomes what you do with the shva. There are a lot of different answers to that. I think the other piece is just on a grammar sense, and again, we won't spend a lot of time on this, is that because there's a vav at the end, it forces the vowels earlier in the word to lengthen, which is why you have a shva here and a kamatz here, is that if you have something, it's called propretonic reduction. That's a linguistic term, right, where it forces, because there's an extra consonant at the end, it forces some of the earlier letters to lengthen. One classic example is the word davar and divarim. In that case, it shortens the vowel, but I think that's what's happening. Again, not a linguist. My sense of grammar is okay, but sure. some version thereof. Okay, let's keep going. Can I get another volunteer to read this next paragraph? Okay, the verse states, "And behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin." Right, and here that's 2 verses before the crying. Right, so this is 45:14. This one's 45:12. So again, we're sort of just like interpreting this encounter. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin. Rabbi Elazar said, Joseph said to his brothers as follows, right? So he's interpreting the sentence. Just as I certainly harbor no resentment in my heart towards my brother Benjamin, for he was not even present when I was sold, so too I harbor no resentment towards you. The verse continues that it is my mouth that speaks to you, which is to say, as my mouth is, so my heart. And I think right here it says ki fi, right? It's here because my mouth, p, ki, p. And again, because the grammatical thing, that it loses the p sound and becomes an f sound. Neither here nor there. What is again? We're starting to see these are just the interpretations of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet's the next one. What are we learning here in this paragraph? What is Rabbi Elazar trying to tell us about this encounter?
Trying to make peace.
Yeah, this is a real reconciliation. We're gonna push as much evidence into these sentences so that we really get that these brothers are reconciled, right? That there's peace, right? That Rabbi Elazar is trying to really ram the point. Joseph doesn't harbor any resentment, not towards his brother, not towards not towards Benjamin, not towards the rest of his brothers, right? And then I think this verse at the end, and I think the thing that the Rabbi Elazar is saying here is actually really, really powerful, which is ki pi, right? Ken li bi, right? My heart and my mouth are in alignment, right? So many times in our lives, in our encounters with people, we say sort of what we mean, but not exactly what we mean. We, whatever. We don't always line up our hearts and our mouths the way that we might. Now, again, there's a difference between being rude and saying something that might be true, but in a rude way, and another, saying something that might be true in a not rude way. Let's sort of hold those distinctions. But it's powerful to say, I am expressing myself honestly here. I'm being internally consistent. Now, whether or not you think the text actually says this, which I think, this is an interpretive effort, right? It's not meant to be an exact explanation. It's meant to give us extra information, right? The Torah very rarely tells us what people think. That's what the Midrash is there for. The rabbis, the Torah itself generally says, here's what people do, here's what people say, here's the action that happens. It doesn't tell us what people are thinking and what they're doing. Sometimes, not always, but very rarely. And so Rabbi Elazar and the other rabbis are really there to help us flesh out all of the extra information.
He's not groveling.
I'm sorry?
He doesn't grovel towards the brothers. He's short and sweet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that he would have.
You don't feel you. When I read it now, and maybe I have to read it a few times, to me, he's saying, okay, it happened, let's get on with it.
Right.
But he's not sufficiently, he does show that he feels sorry. First of all, he doesn't harbor any resentment. He certainly harbored resentment the way he sent the brothers back to get Benjamin. If that wasn't, forget the brothers, what it did to his father.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear that Joseph, before this moment, is being manipulative towards his brothers to try and get them to do whatever he wants, in this case, to get his brother Benjamin. And we could ascribe all sorts of different reasons for it, but I think ultimately it is pretty manipulative.
Well, that's part of his character, if you think about it.
I think so as well. And I think that it's really important. You said something about groveling, like Judah and the other brothers, like they do grovel when they get there because they don't know it's their brother. That Joseph in this moment holds all the cards. Remember that Joseph, it is a famine. Jacob and his sons are in a dangerous state of not having resources. And Joseph holds all the power here. Joseph could say to his brothers, I resent the hell out of you, screw off, go die in the desert. And it would
No,
be,
he didn't have to, yes, he could have said that,
but he didn't.
but he wasn't going to. But
Well,
he was going to make it a little bit unpleasant. He was going to make
So-
them,
so Sheila, I'm going to push back on you here, right? That's because we know the ending of the story. That is no different than saying Mordecai is going to wear Benjamin's 5 change of clothes, right? We know how the story ends. It is just as reasonable for us to say Joseph could have been vindictive with his brothers. Now, having read the rest of the story, we know he doesn't do that. And that's not the kind of thing that a tzaddik, as the rabbis describe him, would do, right? So it's out of character for him to be vindictive. And you're right? He was never really going to do that. But it would have been a reasonable response. And here, right, he makes it point all the more so. Even after all of the mishigas, the craziness that happened, he says, I'm not holding any resentment towards you.
it's interesting, again, the Bible and the Talmud are so concise. If this were a modern story, it would say, even though the additional words would be, even though he had feelings, okay, towards his brothers, he still helped them.
Yeah.
There were, again, the conciseness, so that we are left to wonder, okay, or to dicker the way we're dickering about what did he really feel? He
Yeah.
was human, and he was not really a nice person. I mean, he was manipulative. I mean, but for the good of people.
I think so too. And I'll just add one more piece is, if for those who remember from last week, we and you can look at the YouTube channel and watch the video from last week, that the very first thing we learned about was that Joseph had said to his brothers on their way home after this, don't fight amongst yourselves, right? And we learned the whole thing about don't argue about halacha along your way, because you might get into an argument with your traveling companions, right? So he makes even a further point. If we hold that one into our conversation from last week, we pull it into this week, which is not only he says, I'm not resentful of you, my heart and my mouth are in alignment, and when you go home, move on. Don't fight amongst yourselves about whose fault is what. So we're getting a real sense in the eyes of the rabbis who Joseph really was, that he was really there. His personality, even though he was sort of messing around with them, was ultimately one of kindness and reconciliation and trying to help his family and his people.
And again, they don't elaborate. You would think they're telling you the facts. They're not giving you the musar, which would say, okay, there's a reason for this. If you don't argue about things because it might destroy your ultimate goal, that's left for you to think.
Yeah, I mean, Rabbi Elazar doesn't say
that's
anything.
the Bible and the Talmud.
Rabbi Elazar doesn't say anything here about why we should, my mouth is like my heart. That's such a powerful phrase. The Rabbi Elazar doesn't say anything else about it. It sort of drives me crazy. Tell us what to do with that. All right. With that in mind, let's read a little bit further. I have a shorter text today, so we can really complete it. Maybe, yeah, just a little bit more. And I love this next line. This is what I'm talking. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'm teaching with My Jewish Learning tomorrow. It's on this paragraph, and it says the following. The verse states, right, and we're a few verses later, where Joseph has sent his brothers back home. He says, and to his father, Joseph sent to his father Jacob. He sent in this after this manner 10 donkeys laden with the good things of Egypt. The verse actually continues because he sends more things. It was 10 male donkeys laden with the good things, and then 10 female donkeys with food and grains and other kinds of things. Gemara asks, what are the good things of Egypt that are mentioned but not specified here? And in the language is mituv Mitzrayim, the good of Mitzrayim, the good thing, the best things of Egypt. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet, again, who we saw just a few paragraphs before, said that Rabbi Elazar said, now quoting the guy that we've been talking about, Joseph, sent him, Jacob, aged wine, which the elderly find pleasing. Here it just says Canim, could be elders. Here the elderly translator could be folks who are certainly older than Joseph. So Rabbi Binyamin says, what are the good things of Egypt? Good wine. That is what good things are. Yeah, Ron.
Other than being some amount of proof that the story the brothers are going to tell Jacob is true, what good was it to send that stuff to Jacob when he's going to turn right around and come back? He just have to schlep it back with him.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that, right, we're talking about 15 sort of again, we're in a patriarchal system here in the Torah, and so I'm only framing it this way to think of it that way, in terms of doing the math, right? You have Jacob and his 12 sons, or 10 or 11 sons or whatever, and each of them have families, right? Which means we're talking about 3 to 5, 10 people attached to each of them, but it includes servants and animals. We're talking about a tremendous amount of people. And so my sense is that they need something to get through the immediate need of the famine before they come to Egypt and Goshen. Jacqueline, did you have something? Jackie, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw the little green dot there.
But
hold on, Ron. Jackie, is that a yes? You're already unmuted. Okay, guess not. Go for it, Ron.
all right, where was I? Okay, but if they needed stuff to sustain themselves, that's one thing. But if these were the good things of Egypt, this is stuff that, this is well beyond that.
So let me ask you, why do you think, according to this, Joseph did this?
Well, the only thing I can think of, and I said it when I started out, was in order as proof that Joseph really was the story that the brothers were going to tell was true. That's the only reason I can think of that.
But Ron, also he was saying when he's sending the good things of Egypt, he wants his father and the brothers to come and stay in Egypt. So he wants to make sure that they see that, hey, this is a good place to come to, that there's a lot here and you'll like it.
Yeah, Ron, go for it.
Yeah, but I mean, even so, I mean, I could see Jacob saying, no, I'm staying here. We're just going to keep coming down to get food, because he knew that their destiny was to stay in Israel.
Yeah, so
he should have known that.
right. If Joseph and Benjamin knew about the temples and Mordechai, we can make the similar argument that Jacob knew this as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the point that Rabbi Elazar is making, but I do think your point is well made, which is, if we think about the movement of goods here, what is really happening? Why might that be? I think that there's probably a lot of arguments, but I think, another translation of this says the best things of Egypt, which I think is also a good translation. And if you imagine being, right, Jacob's most beloved son, who he's now discovered is alive, right? And you're that child, sending really wonderful gifts to that parent, right, of which you have a great relationship, I think is, it's like what nicer thing can you do, right? To send a wonderful gift to your parent. And here,
if that's the reason he's sending it, then why, for the last 7 years or 9 years or however long it is since he became the viceroy or whatever you want to call him, did he not try to make contact?
It's a wonderful question.
I know everybody's asked that question forever.
Yeah,
but
I don't have a good answer.
But so I don't see that I don't see that as being a good answer.
I think that's a fair critique. I'll just add sort of spoilers for tomorrow, which is that aged wine is one of the answers, but not the only answer. There's one answer that is a split beans, or the good things of Egypt. And another answer says it wasn't just split beans, but that the beans had an antidepressive quality to them. So they were like, I don't want to say magic beans, but they were like really good beans. They're gonna make you happier, like an antidepressant. I do think, even if you don't think it's aged wine, or you do, or you think it's beans or whatever, I think the challenge, your point is well made, which is to say that, why send anything at all, or why send these particular things? I think there's great challenge to be had there. All right, let's read a little bit more before we finish. I just want to read the last two or three paragraphs. I'm going to read them really quick because they're all sort of a unit. Following Jacob's death, right? So we're in next week's parsha. And his brothers went and fell down before him. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said that Rabbi Elazar said, this explains the folk saying that people say, which I'm sure all of us have said in the past, when the fox is in its hour, bow down to it. Has everyone said that? I'm just kidding. Which is to say, if a fox is appointed king, one must bow down before it and submit oneself to it. Which is to say, like whoever's in charge is in charge. The Gemara expresses astonishment at the use of this parable. Are you calling Joseph a fox? What, was he inferior to his brothers such that in relation to them, you would call him a fox? Rather, the statement was stated as it follows. Not in connection with this verse, but rather in connection with a different verse, meaning to say this whole thing about fox is not about the brothers falling down, it's about something else, which is from the end of this week's parsha to the beginning of next week's parsha. And Israel bowed himself upon the head of the bed. With regard to this, Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said that Rabbi Elazar said, when the fox is in its hour, bow down to it, which is to say, as Jacob had to bow down before his son Joseph, who had reached greatness. Again, also in the dream from before. It says in regard to Joseph's remarks to his brothers, and he comforted them and spoke to their hearts. This is next week's parsha. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said, the Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that he spoke to them words that are acceptable to the heart and alleviated their fears. This is what he said. If 10 lights could not put out one light, as all of you were unable to do to me, how can one light put out 10 lights? Which is to say, again, sort of holding the fox thing as its own little unit, which is, even with all of this, the brothers might be concerned about how they might be treated. And even the Rabbi Elazar was really telling us before, right? His mouth was like his heart. He repeats again, right? I'm not going to harm you. And even if I was, I can't, right? I'm just one person. Now, what's interesting about this is it ignores all of the power dynamics that Joseph might have against his brothers. So it's, I'm not sure I would agree with Rabbi Elazar's interpretation here, but I love the image, which is to say, I'm going to say this to you in a way that you will understand. Right, he spoke to them words that are acceptable to the heart, right? That would be here, Shemitz Kablin al Halev, that would be received in their heart. Okay, so that's all the text I prepared today. We've got a few minutes left. All in all, we've got a couple of stories here about Joseph and his encounter with his brothers and how he treats and how he walks through the world. What do people think? What do people think about these stories sort of together as a unit, as one little sugya?
Well, the thing that I just noticed,
yeah,
and it's not something you said, is when the brothers came to Joseph after Jacob died and bowed down, it's kind of reminiscent of Jacob coming back to Canaan and doing whatever he was going to do with Esau.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understood what you said.
I'm saying Jacob was putting his hands in Esau's hand. I mean, he was putting his life in Esau's hand.
Right. What you're suggesting is that this is
a repeat of that episode.
Joseph, right? That Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers and the danger incumbent within it mirrors the Jacob and Esau dynamic, in which Jacob puts his life basically in his hands of his brother, and there's reconciliation there. I want to make one. I think you're right, and I want to challenge you, which is to say that if you think about what the narrative of the Torah is, Jacob was the powerless one, and is our protagonist, and Esau is ostensibly the bad guy, and this is the opposite. Joseph is our protagonist, and he's the one with all the power. And so you're right that the two stories mirror one another, but they're not exactly the same, which invites us to think really, I think, to ask ourselves really good and challenging questions. Sheila, you had something you were going to say. No? Oh. Other thoughts on this on this unit of text?
It's just, well, I could say that it's just interesting that how they're making a connection. Why did they have to bring Joseph's story altogether into this? They're talking about Purim.
Right. So the reason, again, rabbis being associative thinkers, because of the interpretation that the extra clothing from that was given to Benjamin would be for Mordecai, is how they got there. And they immediately go back to Purim after this. It's just like a little vignette inside.
You know, it's interesting that this is part of Purim, and we're talking about Joseph. But when they started talking about the 10 lights and the one light, my mind went to Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Also, when you're talking about the Joseph and his power, you could also think about, you know, the story of Purim, but in a different light.
Say more
That
about
Esther, that Esther went and was presented to the king and leave Mordecai out of it.
Yeah. I mean, look, there is an interesting journey to be had in talking about comparing Joseph and Esther and and how their power is in relationship and the dynamics to family, right? Mordecai and Esther relating to Mordecai and Joseph to his brothers. There are really interesting parallels, in a way that I think Joseph's story is meant to be taken pretty seriously, and Jacob's story and the Esther story understood more in a more farcical way, right? Just based on the way it's written and things like that. But I do think there's really interesting parallels between the two. Any last thoughts before we end for the day? Wonderful.
Have a good rest of your vacation.
Thank you. It's good to be together. Good to learn. See you guys next week.
Okay.